When the United States entered World War II, the Nazis' control of the European continent extended from northern Norway to the Spanish border, across North Africa, and into much of Russia. It was called Fortress Europe by Adolf Hitler. For the Americans, the only practical means of getting to the enemy was through the air. A strategic bombing campaign was unleashed, and the Axis powers felt the fury of American might for the first time. One of the principal weapons used to bring the Nazis to their knees was the longest-range bomber in Allied hands, the B-24 Liberator.
The B-24 is the range queen. It has a tremendous capability for long-range operation, largely due to what is called the Davis wing, which was a highly refined high aspect ratio wing. What do we mean by high aspect ratio wing? We mean a wing that has a very broad span in relationship to the chord, the distance between the leading and trailing edge. The B-24 was capable of tremendous success as a long-range aircraft. There was a transport derivative of it that was flown in service as well, used in the hump operations over the Himalayan hump, the so-called C-87. It did have some tricky characteristics, the same characteristics that gave it very nice high altitude long-range flying characteristics, the same design characteristics of the airplane, I should say, also endowed it with relatively vicious stall and spin tendencies.
The B-24 had a 110-foot wingspan with a total length of just over 66 feet. Its height was 18 feet, and it was powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines. It had a maximum speed of 303 miles per hour. It weighed 34,000 pounds empty and 65,500 pounds loaded for battle. With a ceiling of 28,000 feet and a range of over 2,300 miles, it carried bombs farther and faster than the B-17. More B-24s were built than any other warplane in World War II. In the opening months of World War II in Europe, the Allies recognized that you could not operate bombers like the B-24 Liberator deep into enemy territory against fighters like the Messerschmitt 109 without taking very heavy losses. The problem of operating a bomber deep into enemy territory was what eventually drove the British to adopt the night bombing philosophy which dominated British strategic bomb operations during World War II. But the Americans were determined to fly daylight missions, simply because the bombers could do a better job of hitting targets. However, by the time the Americans entered the war, the air war over England had been decided. The defeat of the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain, and then the subsequent heavy demands placed upon the German air service, and indeed the entire German military machine, by Hitler's invasion of Russia the following summer, resulted in a near stalemate. England as a fixed aircraft carrier operating off the coast of Europe, was largely immune from invasion at that point. Yes, the Battle of Britain had been won, and it was only a matter of time before the Nazis felt the heat from the B-24 Liberators.
An aspect of the Battle of Britain that is not often appreciated is that there was really a two-part war there, a two-part encounter between the Royal Air Force and the German Luftwaffe, and for that matter the German Navy. And it's that latter part that's often missed. The first part was winning the air superiority war over Britain itself, which the Royal Air Force was able to accomplish, in part because the German military leadership mistakenly retargeted their bombers to go away from aircraft production sites, to go away from fighter command airfields, and to concentrate on urban attacks. That was a dreadful mistake from the standpoint of the Germans. But the second aspect of that war that's often missed is that at the very same time that Royal Air Force Fighter Command was doing this to the Luftwaffe, Royal Air Force Bomber Command and Coastal Command were attacking the invasion ports that Germany would have used to launch its invasion fleet, so-called Operation Sea Lion, and they were destroying the barge traffic and the vessels that would bring those forces ashore. So much so that Germany had to disperse its barge traffic, its small boats, its flotilla of light craft. It had to disperse them up and down the European coast to get them away from this British air attack in 1940. And then, having lost the air superiority war, there was no real opportunity or ability for them to bring all the pieces back together again and then to go back and contemplate seriously an invasion of England without actually undertaking another massive air campaign, and by that time the balance of forces had really shifted against them.
The B-24 was a very good natural complement to the B-17. It enabled missions to be flown that the B-17 could not have accomplished. For example, operations from North Africa to Romania to bomb the Romanian oil fields, the so-called Plosti oil fields, which were a particular B-24 target on two notable raids. The first of these in 1943. The second raid occurred in March of 1944. 7 months after surrendering to the Allies, Italian airfields such as these resounded with growing American air might. Out of the many sky battles, Allied air forces had gradually achieved air superiority. At that point, theater air commanders Generals Spaatz and Aker arrived to plan new strategy with General Nathan Twining, the 15th Air Force commanding general. Spaatz and Aker were handing Twining the biggest job his planners had ever undertaken. They were ordered to fly through Hitler's back door and destroy the oil fields that kept German planes going. General Twining and his staff were ready for the assignment.
Gentlemen, you just received a directive establishing target priorities for the bomber offensive of the 15th Air Force. The decision has been announced. We will destroy oil refineries and synthetic oil plants. Now, Colonel Young, what does our intelligence show us in regard to these targets within our area?
More than 50% of the refineries and synthetic plants producing gasoline for the Axis are within range of the 15th Air Force. Between 25 and 30% of the total Axis production of gasoline is represented by the 10 large refineries around Ploesti. While these refineries were seriously damaged in the attack last August by the task force operating from Egypt, recent photo reconnaissance reveals that, with one exception, all refineries are currently operating at full capacity.
Gentlemen, you've heard the problem. It's a big job we've got ahead of us. The knockout of Ploesti means Germany will be deprived of 1/3 of its oil resources.
The B-24 bomber crews were moved up from Africa to start the Ploesti air siege. On the morning of April 5th, the bombers swung into action, led by 136 B-24 Liberators. The Allies expected the enemy's coastal radar network in Albania and Yugoslavia to spot them as they made their approach over the Adriatic Sea. Although it was still early in the 600-mile run to target, The crews got into flak suits. They were a kind of insurance. Climbing to altitude, the B-24 crews skimmed the Yugoslav mountains, gliding peacefully until they bristled with flak guns. The B-24 crews soon found out the hard way that Plosti had become the third best defended spot on the continent. This was a high-altitude mission, 21,000 to 24,000 feet. As they neared the target, they edged into tighter formations. Each had top cover. They all remembered the 1943 Plosti mission, with 177 Liberators, in which the Allies lost 54 planes. Would this be like that mission? Or would it be worse? 250 Nazi fighters, outnumbering the Allies 3-1, attacked. The Nazi fighters had almost had enough. By the time the B-24 crews crossed the Soviet Belgrade line, the fighters moved in for the knockout punch. Then the B-24 crews ran into flak. 256 heavy guns filled the sky with black, deadly mushrooms. To the intense flak, the Nazis had added smoke. The B-24 crews could almost smell the nauseating acid fog. 2,000 smoke pots effectively covered Plosti. But still, the B-24s pressed on. They delivered their payloads and heavily damaged the Axis oil refinery and paid homage to the lost bomber crews of 1943. The crew member who was most responsible for dropping the bombs was the bombardier. The bombardier had to calculate the downward path of the bomb so that the bomb would land on the desired target. While there is no question that Allied strategic and tactical bombing efforts were team efforts, the bombardiers sometimes felt like the pilots took all of the credit.
I might trot on some toes when I say this, but the bombardier in World War II was the most ignored, important individual that I know of. The bombardier won more medals for pilots than did any other type action performed by pilots. Now, don't jump to conclusions. I'm not demeaning the pilot. It just was the name of the game. It was a pilot's Air Force, and people will say today that it's still a pilot's Air Force. But today's Air Force is not the same as it was then.
There were many uses for the versatile B-24. In the modern precision weapon era, B-24 crews started operating over the North Atlantic equipped with homing torpedoes, going after U-boats. The combination of the homing torpedo and the B-24 closed the mid-Atlantic gap, which was an area where the U-boat command had been able to operate with relative flexibility and impunity. The B-24 excelled in the maritime patrol role, both for the Americans and the Royal Air Force. And also for the U.S. Navy in a derivative called the privateer. The B-24 turned out to be a superb anti-submarine and maritime patrol airplane.
January 1943, French Morocco. President Roosevelt arrived for the important Casablanca Conference. Prime Minister Churchill and the President were making far-reaching military decisions. With the combined chiefs of staff, they planned global operations. Generals Marshall and Arnold had to build up the United Kingdom base in the face of Nazi plans to infest the Atlantic with submarines. Remembering how their U-boats in 1917 had brought England to her knees, enemy leaders were proud of their 1943 plans for a network of sub-pens. Dr. Tote's engineers now built them with 12-foot concrete tops to make the U-boat nest safe from the Allies' heaviest bombs. The enemy had launched a monstrous U-boat program. 300 by 1942, 900 by 1944. This was to be ruthless undersea warfare, masterminded by Admiral Carl Dönitz.
Back in the United States, our new fighters, like the P-47s, were being shipped to England. Fighter aircraft had become so vital in the war against the Axis, they were given high priorities. Because of the submarine menace, Allied navies escorted all convoys.
By torpedoing the freighters, the enemy tried to cut our Lend-Lease lifeline. Killer subs roaming the North Atlantic in the first half of 1942 had sunk 506 Allied ships. Threatened was the security of Great Britain and our build-up for the air war in Europe. Victorious German submarines were organized in wolf packs. Confronted with this desperate emergency, the U.S. Navy called on the Army Air Forces to assist them in the fight.
Our long-range depth bomb-carrying B-24s were the answer. The ultimate workhorse of our counterattack on the U-boats was the radar-equipped Liberator. These land-based planes were matched against a sneaking killer. The enemy operated almost unimpeded along the vital shipping lanes. Plenty of good hunting. First for them, but after May 1943, for us. Most of us in the 1st Bomber Command and later in the 25 squadrons of the Anti-Submarine Command patrolled wide areas ahead of the convoys. On the deck, we searched immense stretches of the Atlantic hunting for Nazi periscopes. Hitler's sub-crews crash dived. Our exploding bombs were clearing the North Atlantic of the Nazi U-boat threat. In those summer months of 1943, the Anti-Submarine Command of the Army Air Forces did a vital job. American fighter planes and badly needed supplies got through.
And in the Pacific, B-24s flown by the Army Air Forces were extraordinarily successful in attacks against the Japanese merchant fleet, and for that matter, against the Japanese Navy. One such action was in the Solomon Islands chains, where General Twining rejoined the Allies' theater commander, General Millard Harmon, in planning operations to defeat the Japanese. The crews had fresh B-24s, and in July were able to launch a 37-day campaign to Japanese-held Munda Field on New Georgia Island. Some of the crew had taken off from Guadalcanal, which American men had bought and paid for with their lives. The B-24 crews hoped the blow the Allies were about to deliver to Munda would make their sacrifices worthwhile. The B-24 crews finally neared the island. As soon as they made the approaches to Munda, jungle-hopping medium bombers went after the Japanese airdrome and its defenses. Then, the B-24 Liberators opened up. Stubbornly, the Japanese held on until the bombers dropped 145 tons of bombs in half an hour. It was the heaviest air bombardment yet in the South Pacific in one day. By the time resistance had ended, the Japanese had lost 350 aircraft. In only 9 days, the Allies rushed the strip into operating condition. P-40s were the first to land, followed by heavy bombers which could easily be carried on the coral runways. Warhawks helped protect the base as the B-24 crews rapidly built it into a key for the Solomon Islands. In a few weeks, traffic exceeded that of any other field in the South Pacific, reaching a peak of 564 aircraft in one day. The Munda campaign had shown the success of a new tactic, bypassing heavily defended enemy points and gaining air superiority behind them. General MacArthur described the island-hopping campaign as a series of battles for airfields. In the South Pacific, as elsewhere in all global operations, the Allies had proved the might of their air power. B-24s had helped clear submarines from the Atlantic. B-24s pounded Japanese targets in China. B-24s had made Pacific island hopping possible. Back in Europe, Nazi factories, made larger by the wealth of conquest, produced weapons for Hitler's war machine. After surviving the intensive bombing of 1943, their assembly lines doubled production. With painstaking German efficiency, the Luftwaffe grew alarmingly strong. By February, destruction of the mounting Nazi manufacturing industry became urgent because their production was rising to the goal of a plane every 15 minutes. Twelve of these factories in Germany and Poland were called point-blank targets and were given top priority. Hitler had looted the manpower and machinery of nearly a dozen European countries. The Luftwaffe had become a massive shield for Fortress Europe. At the same time, steel centers like Dusseldorf and Essen forged mountains of bombs and shells. A key to this production was the transport system. All the supply lines, including canals, were full. The enemy war machine rolled on after a winter during which weather had prevented large-scale Allied air attacks. On February 19, 1944, the weather cleared. Now the B-24 crews started the long-planned attack against the Luftwaffe to win control of the skies over Europe, no matter what the cost. This was to pave the way for invasion. General Eisenhower and his air officers, General Spaatz and Kepner, watched the Allies' joint effort. Most of the B-24s came from General Doolittle's 8th Air Force. The stiffest resistance was expected. To protect 1,000 bombers, the B-24 crews were sending along 1,000 fighters. Most of General Pete Quesada's 9th Air Force fighter pilots had come from units of the 8th Air Force. The battle-wise general had helped drive the Luftwaffe out of Africa. Now he was getting ready for a series of operations which historians called the Big Week. Sunday morning, February 20th, the B-24 crews prepared for the heaviest assault in the history of the American Strategic Air Force up to that time. With a stronger Luftwaffe, this was a big gamble. Some expected possible losses up to 200 bombers and crews. But this was the prelude to invasion, and it had to be done. Gathered together, were B-24 Liberators from Britain and the Mediterranean, the equivalent of 5 air forces, and they were about to hit the Nazis for 6 consecutive days and nights. In the biggest air blitz of the war, the Allies hoped to finally win air superiority over the Luftwaffe. The liberation of Europe was at stake. Now, for the first time, the Army Air Force had the strength to mount a saturation offensive. Some B-24s went to attack airfields and rocket launching sites to pull enemy strength away from the war factories, which was the Allies' main objective. At fighter bases, all fighter command elements were raising the curtain for the invasion. The Allied bombers plowed into enemy air, although the B-24 crews knew the Germans had them spotted. The Allies tried to make the effort appear as a two-pronged drive on Berlin. Ignoring the flak, they kept in close formation for maximum self-protection as the P-47 Thunderbolts caught up. Forewarned, the Germans massed their fighters. They were as determined to stop the bombers as the B-24 crews were to destroy them. Control of the sky, German sky, was the prize. Yes, the B-24 bomber crews were in good hands. When enemy flak explosions were heavy, accurate, and intense, the Germans closed in. Then came a fresh formation of Mustangs to fight off the worst the Germans had to offer. They came down from almost invisible heights to engage the Nazi fighters. In Belgium, France, and Holland, Liberators evaded flak and unloaded over enemy airfields. The commanders hoped the weight of these bombs would force the Nazis to move their airfields inland. Over Germany, it was the same thing. These first 5 days changed the history of the air war, but it didn't end here. By March, the B-24s hit Berlin for the first time. The weight of the Allied attacks increased and held down enemy plane production. As the bombs fell, the B-24 crews pressed the Allies' advantage, barreling in to force the Luftwaffe into combat. The war was moving in the Allies' direction. Any war is a tactical battlefield where armies use their weapons to halt an incoming force or move forward to demolish the enemy. In World War II, the key factor was the ability of the Allies to reach out and destroy the Axis means of production.
In 1945, there was a very interesting book published. It was called Weapons and Warfare, and it was written by Major General J.F.C. Fuller. Now, Fuller was a British Army general. He was one of the major figures behind the advent of armored warfare, the development and the employment of the tank in warfare. He made profound contributions to military education in Great Britain and indeed worldwide through his writings and influence. Fuller was an individual, once again, that we would think of as traditionally a surface warfare advocate. Now, Fuller, taking a look at military history, concluded that throughout military history there were a series of values or attributes that were possessed by weaponry. For example, the lethality of weaponry, the ease with which it could be carried, the reach of weaponry. And he determined that if you take a look at these values, which included things such as precision, which he called accuracy of aim, if you took a look at them, the one factor that stood out, as he said, the single factor around which you have to build the crucible, as he put it, of combined tactics, was reach, which we would consider an attribute of range of air power today. Reach is range plus speed. And his statement in 1945, which I think was very profound, was that at any particular time in military history, reach has been the most critical factor in weapons development. And he said, in the air power era, this means that tactics have to be built around the airplane. And in that perception, he was absolutely on target. And I think we've certainly seen that in the years since the Second World War. If you take a look at why Japan lost the Second World War, Japan lost the Second World War because its sea lines of communication were cut by air attack and by submarine attack. Its forces were pinned in place by air attack and submarine attack, which isolated them. And finally, the home islands were brought under air attack and blockaded by aerial mining and the actions of submarines offshore and things of this sort that basically brought Japan to the point where it collapsed. In Europe, it's a little murkier because you're dealing with traditional warfare across a landmass, a very complex environment to deal with. But nevertheless, we can see even in Europe, in the European campaigns, that air made a very, very big difference in whether one won or lost a particular battle, or won and lost, indeed, a particular war.
As history notes, the Nazis never again had the opportunity to wage a massive air campaign. They became the subject of the largest air armada in history. By 1945, the United States had over 240 air groups and 65 separate squadrons. There was a total of 72,000 aircraft in the Army Air Forces, along with 41,000 naval aircraft. For the cross-channel invasion of Europe, the Army Air Force alone assembled over 10,000 planes. This included 40 heavy bomber groups, which were led by the B-24. The impact of these bombers is legendary.
The German hierarchy after the war, the generals, the men who directed the Luftwaffe and were key staff planners, their words are enough to convince me that the bombing was essentially the point or the action that broke the Third Reich's back.
History owes much to all of the men who served aboard the B-24 Liberator. They destroyed the Axis military-industrial complex. In Europe, they paved the way for the ground troops, and in Asia, saved countless lives by bombing the Japanese into submission. A price was paid for this effort. Except for the infantry, no group in the air or on the ground suffered as high a casualty rate as the heavy bomber crews of World War II. But the men who flew these planes knew what they were up against, and would tell anyone who would listen that the B-24 was the best damn warbird in the sky, and they would fly her into hell and back for freedom, pride, and glory.